Afternoon's session is immigration, amnesty, and the law, which some of you might think is an oxymoronic trilogy. But we'll learn more about it after today. Before we go to the speakers, who I'll introduce in a moment, I get to do my commercial, and that is bring up a subject which I think is a very real subject for the courts of appeal, especially the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, which is the state of immigration appeals and the clogging of our dockets. This may not affect many of you as immigration lawyers, I doubt that you are, but it does affect how long the cases that you have on appeal take to get resolved. The Second Circuit, 20% of its docket is immigration cases. In the Ninth Circuit, I think we're up to 46% of our cases. This causes our delay from filing to determination to go to about 22 months, and in the Second Circuit, it's well over a year. There are some possible solutions to this, at least small step solutions. One would be the better servicing and better staffing of our immigration judges. We have a lot of immigration positions which are still open. 35 judges can still be appointed. The judges, immigration judges who sit without a jury are determining 4 to 6 cases a day. And they cannot possibly give quality performances all the time. The Board of Immigration Appeals now is streamlining its decisions so that we don't get really thought out immigration appeals opinions, which make it much more difficult to narrow the issues and also to determine the all-important issue of issuing stay orders, which allow the appellants to stay around for another couple of years. If there's anything you can do to bring pressure upon your elected representatives and administration to appoint the full budgeted group of lawyers, of judges, and Board of Immigration judges, that would be a great help. Also, there is a great inequality in the spread of immigration appeals. The 8th and 10th Circuit handle approximately 100 immigration appeals a year. Last year in the 9th Circuit, we had 5,166 appeals. This leads one to believe that there could be a better distribution of labor in the capitalistic society. One of the proposals that's been made by Senator Specter is to put all the immigration appeals in the Federal Circuit, a decision, a proposal which met with thundering silence from the Federal Circuit. My asylum cases are granted. If there is no attorney, only about 7% are granted. And I am probably exhibit 1 as to why you should have an attorney in immigration proceedings. I stand before you as probably the only federal judge who was ordered deported I was ordered deported at a hearing, but don't worry about it. The feds aren't about to take me away. I beat the case on appeal before the Board of Immigration Appeal. So with that, let me introduce the panel members who will speak in this order. First, we have Professor Gerald Newman, who is Sinclair Armstrong Professor of International Foreign and Comparative Law at Harvard Law School. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree in mathematics from Harvard College in 1973. Professor Newman went on to receive a PhD in mathematics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1977 and a JD from Harvard Law School in 1980. He has taught immigration and nationality law since 1985 and has written numerous articles on the subject. His research interests include habeas corpus and the rule of law, rights of foreign nationals, and transnational dimensions of constitutionalism. Professor Newman is the author of Strangers to the Constitution, Immigrants, Borders, and Fundamental Law, published by Princeton in 1996. Next on my right, Professor Kris Kobach is a professor of law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City Law School. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree with highest distinction from Harvard University in 1988. In 1992, Professor Kobach received his doctorate in political science from Oxford University, and in 1995 his JD from Yale Law School. Following his graduation from law school, he served as law clerk to Judge Daniel Taha of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. In 2001, Professor Kobach worked as a White House Fellow in the Office of U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft. After his fellowship, he served as counsel to the Attorney General in high-profile immigration-related cases. Next is Dean Alexander Aleinikoff. Dean Aleinikoff is the Dean of the Georgetown University Law Center and Executive Vice President of Georgetown University. He is a graduate of Swarthmore College and Yale Law School. From 1981 to 1984, he was a professor at the University of Michigan Law School. Dean Aleinikoff served as General Counsel and Executive Associate Commissioner for programs at the Immigration and Naturalization Service for several years during the Clinton administration. From 1997 to 2004, he was a Senior Associate at the Migration Policy Institute, where he now serves as the Board of Trustees. Dean Aleinikoff has been a member of the Georgetown faculty since 1990.
For over 16 years. Almost $2 million for over 11 years, $3.25 million more for over 6 years, and roughly $4 million for less than 6 years. The government report doesn't break these figures down by ages, but private demographers estimated in 2004 that there were 1.6 million unlawful resident children and almost 2 million families with at least one unauthorized parent and at least one citizen child. Having 12 million residents without legal status raises serious and complex rule of law issues from a number of perspectives. One is the illegal conduct that brought them here, though in some cases it occurred many years ago. Many children came here by no fault of their own and have grown up in our society and face a serious dilemma because they were lawfully educated here but cannot lawfully be employed. Another rule of law issue is the vulnerability of the unauthorized population to crime or to other violations of their rights. Their status can inhibit them from seeking protection or redress. The continuing presence of these children and adults raises a number of questions. For example, how many years of productive, tax-paying, and otherwise law-abiding life here make up for an illegal start and the acquisition of false documents? How can we efficiently and accurately administer a system that doesn't leave us guessing occupational safety violations and the breaking of unions? Rule of law problems in immigration enforcement should also attract our attention. For example, the failure of DHS to adjudicate meritorious applications and the Attorney General's crippling of the appellate function of the Board of Immigration Appeals in 2002, which produced some of the problems Judge Bea discussed. We should also focus on the illegal conduct of municipal officials. For example, the adoption of unlawful local employer sanctions ordinances, which clearly violate an express prohibition in the 1986 Immigration Act. That prohibition was the product of employers' political power, and I wouldn't try to defend it on a priori moral grounds, but it is the law of the land, and its violation raises rule of law issues like any other positive law. Compliance with law by government officials is, after all, the primary meaning of the rule of law. Thank you.
Professor Kobach.
Thank you, Judge Bea. Ladies and gentlemen, I've decided to focus my comments on the fiscal impact of illegal immigration today, here and now, and talk a little bit about how that works its way into the courts in terms of cases that arise as a result of that fiscal impact. In 1986, Congress carved out a window, and it said that states may impose licensing sanctions upon those businesses that employ unauthorized aliens, and that's exactly what Arizona does. Another case I want to mention, because at trial, the facts came out that illustrate this point about the fiscal burden, is Hazleton, Pennsylvania, which I'm now representing in the Third Circuit. Hazleton, which many of you may have heard about, is a town that passed an ordinance that would restrict landlords renting to illegal aliens knowingly and employers knowingly hiring unauthorized aliens. Their situation was this. The population went from about 22,000 in the last census to about 30,000 today. The bulk of that inward immigration to the city was, it is believed, illegal immigration, and we had some statisticians. The facility had to be built. So you see these burdens, and you see states and localities trying to do something about the problem. Now, one answer that some provide at the federal level is say, well, we just need to solve the problem by legalizing everybody that's illegal, and then we don't have any more illegal aliens. And this is, of course, the amnesty answer. But I would suggest that amnesty only makes the problem worse. First of all, it makes the fiscal impact even greater. The Heritage Foundation recently tried to put a number on this as well. Looking at the Senate amnesty proposal that was debated in May and June of 2007, they calculated that the cost would be $2.6 trillion in additional costs at the federal, state, and local level. And the biggest ticket item there would be putting all of these people on the Social Security rolls and making them eligible for Social Security. The other problem with illegal immigration being solved, if you will, through amnesty, is that it also results in massive amounts of fraud. We know this from experience. The 1986 amnesty, which has already been mentioned, approximately 2.7 million seasonal agricultural workers, or so-called seasonal agricultural workers, were supposed to get the amnesty. It did get it. The INS discovered 398,000 cases of fraudulent applications that they actually found. But there were many more cases of fraud that they did not discover. Among them was Mahmoud the Red Abu Halima, who was one of the leaders of the 1993 attacks on the World Trade Center. He got an amnesty as an agricultural worker, even though he'd been driving a cab in New York and presumably, beginning the plotting of his terrorist acts. His brother Muhammad also got amnesty under the 1986 amnesty. And part of the reason that these amnesties, especially these massive ones, are such a recipe for fraud is that you're talking about such an incredibly huge number of people that is imposed on a very small bureaucracy. We only have about 3,000 status adjudicators at USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services. Now they hire some contractors to, when something like this happens, to expand, to broaden the workload among more people. But the bottom line is we simply don't have the administrative capacity to handle it. Right now there's an unofficial 6-minute rule at place. This is without any amnesty. And we get about 6.3 applications. In fiscal year 06, there were 6.3 million applications for benefits. And that's such a huge workload on top of the backlog of millions of cases that already exist that they have to go at 10 person, and we simply don't have the bureaucracy to screen them all. So finally, let me summarize by saying that although immigration is very costly, and that's pushing the states and localities to act, and I think certainly in the case of Hazleton and Arizona, they are acting properly, a massive amnesty is not the answer. Indeed, when the states do act, that's not a bad thing, because if the states can offer the federal government help, then that's much better than the states doing the opposite, like New York Governor Eliot Spitzer suggested, where the states hinder and offer driver's licenses and de facto amnesty and make life easier for illegal aliens who want to reside and have all of the privileges of legalization without actually having the stamp of legalization. So the fiscal burden must be recognized, and we need to realize that that's what's pushing some of these cases into the courts.
This is a divisive issue, but it's interesting that it's not one that necessarily falls along partisan lines. Recall last summer that President Bush made common cause with the Democratic majority in the House and the Senate, and they were unable together to pass comprehensive immigration reform legislation. Why is that? Well, I think Rudy Giuliani may have had it right, and that's not something I normally say, but maybe it's just attendance at Federalist conferences that make me move in that direction, or maybe it's because he'll be speaking from this podium in about an hour's time, but elements together. Here was the claim. We were going to end illegal immigration forever. And the idea was that we'd legalize those long-stayers who were here, and for new arrivals, they wouldn't be able to get work because employers would turn them away at the workplace because they wouldn't have adequate documents. Now, we know that failed dismally. The 1986 law failed because of the ready accessibility of fraudulent documents, which meant that employer sanctions, the employer sanction provisions in our bill, widely followed by all employers, and yet has zero deterrence because of the availability of bad documents. But whatever the story was, it worked in 1986. That story doesn't sell in 2007. There's no reasonable claim that the package of measures that were talked for many in the debate. So from the left, the story was one of human rights. Undocumented workers had earned their status in the United States, and this wasn't an amnesty. People didn't buy it. People said these are undocumented immigrants. Yes, they have basic human rights not to be subjected to harsh treatment, but they didn't have a right to a status. They didn't earn that simply by coming here and working for a few years. From the right, the narrative was one of undocumented immigrants are criminals. They're lawbreakers, they're queue jumpers. And that wasn't true for most Americans. Most Americans know undocumented workers in one way or another, and that doesn't fit the story. In fact, most undocumented immigrants are rather law-abiding other than the initial illegal entry because they don't want to fall into the hands of the next generation or two. People in the primary working years, from 18 to 54, native citizens in that category, the size of that group will not grow for the next 20 or 30 years. As many people will be entering it as leaving it. If we're going to grow our workforce and have a dynamic economy, that will have to come from immigration or for people working longer into the future. Secondly, immigration flows have an hourglass kind of a form that fit the needs here. The immigrants tend to be either more high-skilled than average Americans or work in lower-skilled jobs where there are real needs. This suggests the need for some kind of legal status for the 6 to 7 million undocumented workers already here, a significant integration policy that brings people in, teaches them English, integrates them into the societies in which they're located, and not a significant cut in immigration levels as we try to grow our population, our workforce population, in a sensible way that most of the rest of the Western democracies are struggling with because of a dramatic decline in their workforce. In this story, enforcement is not a price you pay for regularization. You know, in the debate we just had, people said, well, I'll give you legalization if you give me enforcement. Rather, enforcement is what you do because you have a system that needs to have integrity to it. It's a necessary part of a system of rules and laws. Let me say just, if I have one more minute here on the rule of law. Judge, can I have one more minute? Okay, this is a fun story. So there's a new citizenship test that the Department of Homeland Security has just announced that will be given to people when they naturalize. There are 100 questions that are listed, and they tried to make it a little harder than the past one, which included things like how many stripes are there on the flag. And one of the questions is, what is the rule of law? And you're supposed to answer that in 4 or 5 words. I find that an interesting question. So here are the 4 suggested correct answers. 1, leaders must obey the law. 2, government must obey the law. 3, no one is above the law, reasonable ones. And 4th, everybody must follow the law. I think Jerry Newman may have signed on to this 4th one, but I may have a quibble with him on this if I understood him properly. I was talking to the people drafting this test, and I said, why do you have everybody must follow the law as your reading of what the rule of law means? And they said, well, because of the immigration debate. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, because all these people who come in illegally, they're not following law, and we don't have a rule of law unless we have people following the immigration law. That seems to me to be fundamentally wrong. You may have a breakdown in the immigration system that means you don't have a rule of law because you have arbitrary enforcement actions or no enforcement at all. But it seems odd to me that say that because people come to meet the demand of employers here that you don't have a rule of law. I think that's hyperbole, and I think it's out of place. It seems to me that what we need in this system is a law of sensible rules. That is one that starts with regularization of status, reorganizes the categories we have, recognizes the long-term trends in immigration so that the benefits of immigration
ought to be legal. That's the kind that we need, and that's related to the rule of law. But the rule of law also includes questions of separation of powers and federalism. So it seems to me that one of the things we have to do is ask ourselves about these means to the end. We agree on an end, but what about the means? And this is often what does not get discussed on television. So briefly, I would like to talk about what I see with the simple, wrong with the simple solution and how we might approach it in a more, I would say, constitutional way. You can fence the border if you want. first of all, it's going to take a long time. And secondly, there's a lot of evidence to the effect that some of the efforts we made in the past have only compounded the problem. There was a brief reference by Professor Newman to the fact that people felt pressured since 1986 to stay more in the country. The reality, if you talk to immigration lawyers, is that in the past, if they were in here illegally, they went back and they got in illegally. The reality today is that we have a fundamental problem that goes back to the 1996 legislation that involves bars to reentry. That is, there's a 3-year bar, a 10-year bar, and a permanent bar. So this whole notion that we can solve the problem by getting them to go back to their country, stand in line, and come back legally is simply based on a false premise. It's not possible to do that under the current situation. The roundup. Contrary to impressions, Homeland Security, especially since the last 6 months or so, has been increasing enforcement. It's not only roundup, it is focusing on businesses in particular. But they realize that they haven't the resources to do it all. And that's why there's an emphasis promoted by Professor Kobach of getting state law enforcement involved. But you've got to face the problem that the Department of Justice simply isn't taking a number of the cases that are being made. Part of it may be that they're bad cases. Part of it is also that U.S. attorneys are not completely ruled by Washington. And indeed, many in Congress don't want U.S. attorneys being told what to do by the White House or even the Attorney General. So we've got a problem here in terms of enforcement internally. The states, Professor Kobach has written about the power of the states to enforce immigration laws, or at least under certain provisions. This is a complex problem. I would just point out two things. At one end, the federal government under Prince cannot force states to engage in enforcement of federal laws. That's a separate question from the question of whether states are bound in courts by federal laws. But in terms of co-opting state agencies, executive agencies, Prince pretty much rules it out. On the other hand, there are also limits on what states can do. This goes back to the passenger cases in 1849. There are certain things states can do under the police power, but there are limits on what states can do in terms of discouraging immigration. Indeed, New York and Massachusetts attempted back then to keep the Irish out, and they couldn't, because ultimately immigration is a social issue, and it is one committed to the federal government, not to the state government. So in terms of the problems, it really does come down to Congress and how it deals with this issue. But that doesn't mean that you don't do immigration first, enforcement first. Remember, Republicans gave us, beginning in the 70s, a law and order approach to things that 20 years later people have realized have federalized much of crime in this country. If you look at the creeping jurisdiction of Homeland Security into critical infrastructure that is now including meatpacking plants, you realize that we are doing internally, we are stretching internally the war on terrorism to the point that we are militarizing law enforcement. Now, just as I think the left is wrong to judicialize war, it is wrong to centralize and militarize law enforcement. Why?
Considerations of the public health risks, or is there an argument you can oppose to Rudy's argument?
Yeah, that argument actually went all the way to the Second Circuit, and Rudy ended up losing. Basically what happened was, you're right, in 1996 there were two laws. There's the Welfare Reform Act, which said that states can't give public benefits to illegal aliens, but included an exception for emergency medical services. Now, that exception, some would say, has been blown wide open, because now, quite often, many emergency rooms around the country are used as sort of one-stop shops, depending on how officious the hospital is in enforcing the emergency care only rule. Mayor Giuliani said that he would not check alien status and would not report people's status to the federal government, and he continued a policy that had been adopted before his tenure at mayor, essentially a sanctuary policy, a don't ask, don't tell policy. And when the 1996 Immigration Reform Act came in, that had a clause in it that said that no state shall adopt a policy restricting or limiting the communication between its officers and the federal government about a person's immigration status. So suddenly the New York policy was at odds with the federal government's new law, and he sued, making a 10th Amendment argument, saying that he had a 10th Amendment right not to tell the federal government and to continue providing such services. But of course he lost in the end. The answer is, yeah, we can provide emergency medical services, and I think it is appropriate to provide emergency medical services, but to, you know.
Well, I don't think, I mean, you've got 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. The idea that you're going to have criminal prosecutions of that many people seems quite unlikely. You don't have the prison space or the prosecutions. So I don't think that's a realistic possibility.
Can I respond to that too?
I'd like to respond.
You know, people often present this as a dichotomy between roundups and or imprisonment of illegal aliens versus a massive amnesty, and that's a false dichotomy. There is an approach in the middle that works perfectly well, and that's attrition through enforcement. Illegal aliens, like all people, are rational decision makers, and they weigh the risks and the costs of their actions. Right now, between 300 and 400,000 people self-deport every year. It's just that the incoming flow is, you know, somewhere around 1.5 million. And so
I would like to only partially agree with Professor Kobach. Here's the rule of law requires that most people voluntarily obey the law. We don't want a situation where people only obey the law because of force. Indeed, if a society has to rely totally on force, it's not a free society. What happens now is different from what happened before 1996, as I tried to indicate. But put yourself in the position of an immigration lawyer, and I am not one, but I talked to some of them. And now they have to say, well, look, you're here illegally, and here's what the law is, and they're going to find out, the illegal, that in fact...
In the back.
Yes, this would be to any member of the panel. Professor Tucker, Joe Tucker, has suggested there may be a correspondence between the jurisprudence of the Ninth and Second Circuits and to the enormous caseload that they're now undertaking, faced with in the near future. To what extent would you agree with that, or is there another significant contributing factor?
Is that a question to me?
If you'd like to answer.
I believe that immigration lawyers are also among those rational decision makers that we find. The grant rate for asylum cases in the Fifth Circuit is 9%. In the Ninth Circuit, it's 37%. If you were an immigration lawyer and you had an illegal from Mexico, would you give them up in Texas, in the Fifth Circuit, or in Arizona, in the Ninth Circuit? I think that's one of the reasons why we have to take immigration appeals and spread them out through different circuits in the country to eliminate forum shopping. Mr. Rossinello.
Thanks, Judge. I was the U.S. Attorney for San Francisco from 1982 to 1990, and so...
and soon to be again.
Apparently.
Nominated yesterday.
But in any case, in addition to the costs that you mentioned, there are two other specific problems that I think impacting the legal system are involved here. And wisdom, as a result of the investigation, made the record of all of that documentation protected by privacy laws so that it was not available to anyone to look at. So there are significant numbers of people now who probably are voting who are not citizens of the United States, and the claims that somehow or another this is not happening are just based on a lack of information. That's a problem that needs to be addressed, I think. The second is even more important, and that is that significant numbers of people did not take advantage of the amnesty of 1986 because they had so integrated themselves into the population by that time they couldn't suffer the embarrassment of having to admit that they weren't citizens. And those people are still in the population. and there are significant numbers of them who have been added to it. Juries throughout the country are probably made up of people who include some of those members. What's the effect of having been convicted by a jury that's not made up of citizens of the United States? How do you, in your wisdom, how do you suggest that any program that's either been offered here as part of Amnesty or any return to native country or anything else, how do you suggest that any of the remedies that have been proposed to date would address what I think are two very, very serious problems that undermine our whole system of justice?
I can answer part of that. There's some evidence for what you suggest is happening. It's certainly happening in Texas. Recently, some county clerks in Texas were finding that people were coming to them saying, hey, you've got me on your jury pool list, and the jury lists are drawn from the voter rolls. I'm an alien. I don't have to serve on this jury, do I? And the clerks were tracing back, and they found out that they got on the list because when they got their driver's license, they checked the box and became voters, and said, they also checked the box that says U.S. citizen. I guess they didn't read it carefully, and so as a result, by giving people access to the voter rolls, they then got onto the jury list, and then this problem was revealed. One solution to the problem is simply this: most states, when you register to vote,
it troubles me, quite frankly. Let me say something else about this. Let me say something else about, in answer to what Kris had earlier said. Suppose you adopt very harsh criminal penalties, and suppose the theory of deportation by attrition, whatever the phrase is, works, and 2 or 3 million undocumented immigrants leave the state of California. What's the impact of that on the economy and the social fabric of California? Many undocumented immigrants live in mixed families. They have permanent resident alien spouses and kids and citizen kids. They are full-fledged members of their community in terms of attending churches, in terms of other social organizations, in terms of working and paying taxes, in terms of owning houses. What do you think the impact on the economy of California would be? So people who propose either that we have mass roundups or very harsh policies that send people home have to think about the impact on this country and the way these people are living their lives. That's what suggests, it seems to me, a reasonable legalization program that says to people who haven't committed crimes except for the illegal entry, who have not committed crimes, who've paid their taxes, who've worked for a long period of time in the United States, are important and necessary part of our society and should be recognized as such, rather than penalized and subject to very harsh criminal penalties.
Professor Baker.
I think that Dean Aleinikoff is right to say about our lack of evidence. And again, I come back to the purpose of enforcement ought to be for us to know what the economic impact will be. And I think you're right that there's going to be a huge economic impact. And the American people can choose. Either they want to accept that economic impact or maybe they want to modify it. For those of us who are getting a little bit older, I start to worry about, are there going to be enough nurses to take care of the boomers as we retire? And it may be when they realize that you can't afford any kind of health care because we haven't got any nurses, then all of a sudden people may be interested in opening up the quota for Philippine nurses or Indian nurses or whatever. There's no reason why we can't have a more rational allocation and increase in the number of legal immigrants. But again, you've got to force Congress to do this, and they're not going to do it.
Percent of the illegal immigrants. Then we still need solutions for what we're going to do with regard to the people who we haven't been able to get rid of. One of the questions was about the public health consequence. What are the epidemiological consequences of having people who are out of the healthcare system? There are also law enforcement consequences. When the Proposition 187 was being voted on in the mid-90s in California, the Sheriff's Department of Los Angeles County came forward and said, look, we don't want all these teenagers thrown out of the school and being on the streets. It is more of a law enforcement problem for us to have illegal alien children thrown out of the schools than it is to have them in the schools. And again, I'm saying I don't have a solution, but I think it's important for us to focus on how many different parts of the problems we need to have solutions for before we know that we have a solution.
The last comment, Professor Kobach, and then we're going to have to vacate the room for Mr. Gerald.
Yeah, the question being about international cooperation, we do see some cooperation. Obviously, Mexico, being our southern neighbor, is where a lot of these trafficking networks flow through. We do have some cooperation with Mexico on certain drug smuggling networks, but that cooperation is less than what it could be. And we have certainly a real need for more cooperation with generally slowing the immigration products at the grocery store, and the price of having a new roof on your house would probably also go up. But the fiscal cost that all of us taxpayers are bearing would go down, and I think that's a reasonable trade-off.
All right, let me... Thank you, members of the panel, and we are adjourned.
Thank you, Judge. It was an honor to
When I come up here, can we have lunch?
Sure.
Okay, good, thank you.